So, what exactly is this place called again? Theo looked round the passenger seat to shoot me a slightly annoyed gaze as the SUV drove up the empty 2-lane road, jostling slightly as the truck hit a pothole. Dude, exactly how wasted were you last night? I told you, the beach and the park have virtually the same name. Birch Point Beach and Birch Point Beach State Park. Duh. I snorted back at my friend, smirking and flipping him the bird before returning to gently massaging my temples. For a few more moments, the world tilted slightly, then seemed to pass, allowing me to let out a small sigh of relief. I'm originally from New England, having been born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. When I graduated high school, I decided that I didn't want to spend my entire life living in the same area I'd been born in. And so, setting my wings, I set out to find a place I could carve out as my own. Eventually, I settled across the country in eastern Washington and started my own construction business. I made good money and I also made plenty of new friends, but I couldn't help but miss home at times. I'd go back during the holidays to spend them with my mother, but aside from that, I never really went back. Until I got a phone call from my old pal Theo. Dude, you have seriously gotta take a break from work and come stay with me and Vaughn for a week at his parents' old summer home in Owl's Head. In any other situation, especially with clients breathing down me and my employees' necks, I'd have declined, but the call came just after my girlfriend had told me she was splitting from me, so wanting some time to unwind and get away from it, along with life in general, I left my assistant in charge and boarded a plane for Maine the very next day, and now, here I was, crumpled in the backseat of the -1986 Jeep Grand Wagoneer that Vaughn had inherited from his parents, heading for someplace I'd never heard of before. The throbbing feeling returned, and I let out a soft groan before putting my head in my hands. You're 34 years old, Evan, and you just spent last night getting wasted to the gills at a rager like you're still in your early 20s. And, to top it off, you're running on just 5 hours sleep. That, if you look it up in the dictionary, is the textbook definition of the word stupid. Something hard gently bumped into the top of my head, and I looked up to see Theo holding out a bottle of Gatorade. I took it gratefully, uncapping it, and taking a swig. You look like shit warmed over, you know that, right? He asked, finally letting loose with a smile of his own. The cold drink felt amazing going down my throat, driving away some of the dehydration I felt and fueling my retort. Then I look just like I feel, although with the bags under your eyes, you won't need to make much of a Halloween costume this year to take your little sister trick-or-treating. Vaughn suddenly let out a loud bark of laughter from the driver's seat, causing both of us to jump slightly. Ouch. Dude, you just got burned something spectacular, Theo. He looked away from the road long enough to shoot a grin at him. You gonna need some aloe vera for that one. Theo rolled his eyes at the lame joke, but it caught me off guard enough that I began snickering. He was about to say something when Vaughn interrupted him. We're here. I pulled myself up slightly from the leather seat to stare out the windshield. He was right. Ahead of us lay a medium-sized parking that stretched out in a rectangle. I noted with slight interest that there were only 1 or 2 other cars here. As if sensing my gaze, Vaughn spoke again. Not many people come here this early in the morning. They're down in town having breakfast, or still asleep. I let out a grunt in reply as he pulled into an empty space and parked. For a few moments, the three of us simply sat in the truck, listening to the call of birds filtering in through the closed windows, as the sky became lighter, hinting that dawn was just about to break. Then Theo spoke up. Well, let's hit it, gentlemen. And with that, he unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed open the door and hopped out, slamming it shut behind him. I let out another soft groan as the sound reverberated in my head, making my ears begin ringing like I had a bad case of tinnitus. Vaughn looked round at me, a small look of concern on his face. Sure you're okay, Evan? I took a deep breath, blinking my eyes a few times before answering. Yeah, I think so. Just drank a little too much last night. My head feels like I just got off the old tilt-a-whirl at Canopy Lake Park. He let out a soft chuckle. Well, you kinda went a bit overboard last night, bro. His face turned back from amused to concerned. Tell you what, When we get to the beach, you can crash on the towel for a bit, sound copacetic. I nodded, feeling thankful that out of the two of my friends, Vaughn was the one who had always looked after us, had since we'd been kids. He reached over and patted me on the shoulder. Come on, before Theo gets impatient and pissy. Together, we pushed open our respective doors and stepped out. The cool breeze felt like a godsend against my brow, and I inhaled deeply, smiling at the ocean breeze which invaded my nostrils. Ah, the smell of the ocean. It invigorated me a bit, and I strode around to the back of the Jeep, where Vaughn was lowering the tailgate to retrieve the bag of towels and water he'd tossed in earlier. After shutting the tailgate again and letting the rear window roll back up, he pulled the key out and motioned for us to follow him. For a few minutes, we walked in peaceful silence, the only sounds heard being the birds in the trees around us and the growing crash of waves against the shore. Then the trees parted, allowing us our first glimpse of the place we'd been brought to. Theo let out an awestruck laugh. Holy crap, V, you've been holding out on us. The beach looked nothing less than something you'd find on the front of a postcard, which you'd send back home to make people jealous of your trip. It stretched out to either side of us in a sort of crescent moon shape, the rocky ground giving way to sand that led to the water's edge. Vast swaths of pine and fir trees encircled the entire beach, looking very much like sentries guarding a hoard of treasure, and the smell of pine needles intermingled with the ocean spray. Seagulls cried from overhead, and I turned my gaze to look out to sea. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon, and the dark shapes of what I realized, where the Muscle Ridge Islands were framed in its glow. I let out a soft laugh of my own. Dude, this is fantastic. How the hell isn't this place more known? Vaughn began walking towards the sand, the two of us following along. It's always managed to fly just under the radar of most tourists. He called over his shoulder to me. They prefer going to the huge beaches down in York or Ogunquit, and that means this place stays a small slice of paradise for the locals. Like me, he dropped the tote bag on the sand, reaching in and pulling out 2 bottles of water, which he handed to us as another grin began to spread across his face. And, for the next hour or two, we have the entire place to ourselves. Theo let out a whoop at the news, one which made me wince slightly as it echoed in my head. But I couldn't help but give a grin of my own. Regardless of how you feel, this place is dope. A sudden burst of movement caused me to swing my head around, just in time to see Theo begin sprinting for the water. Last one is a plucked turkey, he shouted, pulling off his shirt and throwing it behind him. Vaughn shook his head and turned, giving me a slightly amused smile. I let out a snort of my own. Every fish and crab in the bay is gonna think he's absolutely Jim Dandy when he hits the water and stirs up the bottom, I muttered, causing him to chuckle. You ain't joking, man. I took another swig of water before dropping the bottle on the sand. Crossing my arms over my head, I began to wrestle my shirt off. Dude, I told you when we got here you could crash on a towel for a little bit, I heard him say. I finally freed myself from the shirt, casting it to the sand next to the bottle. If I don't at least take a dip in along with you guys, I'll never hear the end of it from him. I hooked a thumb at the figure which was now beginning to splash around in the shallow water like he was a little kid again. I'll just humor him with a few minutes swim, then hop out and lay on the towel for a bit. Besides, swimming in the oceans always helped clear my head. He looked like he wanted to argue, again being the older brother type, but instead nodded before pulling his shirt off as well. Race you to the water, then? He asked me. I nodded. A second later, the two of us took off. The cool wind whipped in my ears, and I vaguely heard Theo egging us on, but my gaze was focused on the shoreline, pouring all the power I could muster into my legs as I awkwardly ran in the sand. My head began to spin again, and I silently prayed that I wouldn't suddenly pass out and fall on my face. This is so freaking stupid, but no turning back now. And then I reached the water's edge. Even in the middle of summer, the Atlantic Ocean felt absolutely breathtaking in how chilly it was. Holy shit, it's cold. I involuntarily yelled out. But I kept going, running until the water reached my knees, where I launched myself forward. The cold water felt shocking as it completely enveloped me, and I couldn't help but shudder as my body slid through the water, my eyes pulled tightly shut to prevent the seawater from stinging them. My head breached the surface, and I sputtered out as I heard a disappointed cry. Damn it, Evan. Even hungover you can still kick my ass. I pushed the hair out of my eyes and turned back to find Vaughn standing in the waist-deep water, grinning at me. Guess I still got it was all I said. Theo slapped me on the back, congratulating me. Then he turned and began swimming around, laughing as he would dive underwater and surface a few moments later. I shook my head as my feet touched the bottom and I stood up. Another wave of the hangover hit me hard, and I closed my eyes for a moment to center myself. It was a bit hard to do with the water gently rising and falling around me in rhythm with the pounding in my head. "You alright, man?" I opened my eyes to see Vaughn gazing at me, even more concerned than he had been before. And this time, I didn't blame him. This truly was a stupid idea, dumbass. I swallowed before answering. "I think so. I'm just gonna go wait around for a few minutes and then pop out the towel and lay down for a bit." My friend nodded, then gestured to the pair of legs now sticking out of the water. "Go on, I'll keep an eye on this numbskull to make sure he doesn't hurt himself." Nodding, I turned away and waded towards the left side of the beach, making sure to keep the point in my vision so I wouldn't accidentally wade out too far. The waves gently slapped my body, and as I drew further away from the hooting and hollering behind me, I began to feel a little better. Being in nature had always worked as a sort of natural healing salve for me, and this was no exception. I gazed down into the water, looking at the shimmering world that my legs walked through. A rather annoyed crab scuttled out of my way as I approached, raising its claws as if challenging me to a duel. I chuckled softly, "Not today, buddy. I'm nowhere near in the mood." A few small fish darted about just ahead of me before streaking between my legs and out into deeper water. The distant crash of the waves on the rocky shoreline further out completed the idyllic, peaceful scene, and I felt my pounding head lessen slightly. That was when the feeling came over me. To this very day, I can't fully describe what it was. All I know is one moment I was feeling content. The next, it was like lightning bolt had gone up my spine. The shiver that coursed through me was stronger and more noticeable than any I'd had before in my life, and it caused me to freeze in place. My head snapped up, and I looked around me. Aside from the gently lapping waves, nothing disturbed the water around me. I shot a gaze behind me. Vaughn and Theo were still at the other end of the beach, now engaged in some sort of diving competition. No one was paying attention to me. Then what the hell was that? I wondered. Another feeling washed over me, this time much easier to distinguish, though far less welcome. It was the feeling of being watched, being stared at. Having had to dodge more than a few sketchy people every time I had to travel to Seattle for meetings with clients, it was a feeling I knew all too well. I'd learned how to distinguish the difference between a pair of benevolent eyes watching me and those with, well, shall we say, more malicious intentions in mind. This feeling was firmly in the latter category. My gaze suddenly swept up towards the tree line. I remembered seeing the two other cars in the parking lot, and my mind began to conjure up the image of someone standing just inside the tree line, watching us like a scene from a horror movie, but nobody stood staring at us. Not that I could see, anyways. Still, the feeling persisted, almost seeming to grow in intensity a little. I gave my head a shake. Get a grip, dude. Nobody is watching you. Nobody else is here. Wanting to take my mind off it, I instead turned and looked ahead of me, down into the water. The light-colored sand and pebbles stretched away for another 15 or 20 feet. Then, the bottom changed to a slightly darker color, looking a little bit covered with muck and seaweed, indicating the slope which led out to deeper water. For a moment, I simply stared at it, my head slightly tilting to the side. Something was scratching at the back of my mind, very faintly, but I couldn't understand what it was. Why's that look weird to me? Nausea suddenly slammed into me, and the dizziness returned with a vengeance. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I turned away from the spot, rushing to get out of the water. Emerging onto the beach, I raced up towards the trees, hearing Vaughn vaguely call my name. But I was focused on one thing only. I reached the first tree and leaned against it, taking a single breath before vomiting onto the ground. For a minute, I just leaned against the tree and threw up. The pounding in my head sprang up its head, and I fought for breath against a sting of stomach acid in my mouth and throat. The world began to spin, and I thought I'd faint where I stood. Dude, holy hell. I turned, seeing Theo and Vaughn standing next to me. Vaughn pulled me away from the tree and gently began guiding me back towards the tote bag. "Come on, man, you need to lie down," he said. Reaching our stuff, he signaled for Theo to lay out one of the towels, then slowly eased me down to sit on it. He picked up my shirt from the sand, shaking it off and handing it to me. "Put this on and try and relax," he said, before looking up at Theo. "He ain't going back in the water, bro. Last night really did a number on him." I heard Theo let out a slightly disappointed sigh. "Sure, whatever. He used to be able to hold his drinks a lot better than this, man. That's because I gave up the party life and grew up, unlike you, I thought, but kept my mouth shut." Pulling my shirt over my head, I lay down on the towel so I could look out at the dark water. Vaughn spoke again, slightly annoyed by our friend's tone. Look, he needs to rest. You can go back in the water if you want, but keep an eye on him. Where the hell you going? Theo asked. I'm going to take a quick hike on the trails to cool off, especially after that little quip you made about our friend. I began to close my eyes. Sleep was calling my name, and she was insistent about it this time. I heard Vaughn walk away, muttering to himself. Theo appeared in the narrow band of my vision. He looked down at me, a slightly guilty expression on his face. Then he leaned down and patted my shoulder. Feel better, bro, he said softly. I grunted in reply as he turned to run back to the water. As I stared at the ocean, the feeling I'd had while waiting returned to me, this time dulled by the encroaching sleep. For a moment, I realized it almost felt like something had told me not to keep moving forward. A new feeling poked its head out, one I couldn't place, but it was just as quickly chased away. I heard Theo splashing, signaling he'd re-entered the water. My eyes closed. For a small time, I lay in a sort of half-awake, half-asleep state, listening to the sounds of the gulls overhead and the splashing of my friend in the water. The rising sun felt warm against my wet skin. There was suddenly a single splash, louder than the others, almost pulling me back to the waking world. Then it was quiet, peaceful. A small smile crossed my face. The next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake. For a few moments, I attempted to resist, as I'd been in the middle of a very pleasant dream, but the shaking remained insistent, and I gradually became aware of a voice calling my name. Evan, wake up, man, please. I let out a grunt, signaling I was awake as I rolled over onto my back. The voice came again. Come on, buddy, you need to wake up. I finally cracked my eyes open, jamming them shut against the blinding sun. I'm awake, I muttered, pulling myself into a sitting position. My head still throbbed, though not as much as it had before. Something was placed into my hand, and after a moment of feeling, I realized it was a pair of sunglasses. Flipping them open and sliding them on, I was finally able to open my eyes. Vaughn stood above me, looking around in almost a frantic motion. When he looked down at me, I snapped fully awake as I caught sight of the expression adorning his face. He looked beyond worried. Dude, what is it? I asked. Did you happen to see Theo leave the beach, or even hear him say anything about going anywhere? His question made me rise to my feet, on slightly shaky legs. I looked around. The beach, aside from the two of us, was completely deserted. Nobody played in the water, and nothing moved in the woods behind us. The hell? No, I finally answered. No, I didn't. The last thing I remember was him running back to the water after you took off. I heard him splashing around, and then I fell asleep. Great, Vaughn muttered, then gestured down. Well, he couldn't have gone that far. He left his shirt and shoes here. He was right. Theo's shoes and t-shirt still lay where he'd dropped them. My mind began to turn faster and faster. I looked at my friend. Could he have gone back to the Jeep for something? A look of relief suddenly flashed in his eyes. Come on, let's go quickly look. And with that, he led the way back up the trail, walking slowly so that I could keep up. The dizziness hadn't fully gone away, but at least I felt confident I wouldn't pass out now. I felt sure that we'd round the corner and see our friend rifling through the truck for something. We did leave our phones in the Jeep anyways, but as we rounded the last bend and the parking lot came into view, that hope was torn from me like a fish in a shark's mouth. The Jeep sat silently where we'd parked it, the doors still locked. Shit, Vaughn hissed as he stopped for a moment. A rustling sound suddenly came from the direction of one of the trailheads, and we looked up, half expecting to see him. But instead, a stranger walked out of the woods in hiking attire. He cast us a look as he walked to his car and got in, starting the engine and driving away. Vaughn cursed again. Come on, we need to get back to the beach and try to find him. I agreed, and the two of us half walked, half ran back to the beach. The slight annoyance I'd had towards Theo when I'd been woken up had now been replaced by a slight worry. The guy can be a complete jackass at times, and he can also be a bit self-centered, but he's my friend. We burst back out into the sunlight and looked around the empty beach. Nothing had changed since we left. Let's check the woods around the edge and the oceanside trails. Then we come back here, I said, offering a plan. He nodded, then looked at me. You good to check the right side on your own for a few minutes? I nodded, and he patted my shoulder before taking off towards the left side of the beach. Turning towards the right, I did the same. For what my waterproof watch told me was 10 minutes, but felt more like an eternity, I walked through the trees and along the trails, calling out Theo's name. I could hear Vaughn doing the same. The faint sound of his call drifted across the mouth of the bay. Finally, I made my way back to the beach, the worry intensifying from finding no sign of him. God, I hope he didn't do something monumentally dumb and hurt himself. Vaughn met me by the towels. I shook my head as he raised his hands to me. He let out a loud sigh as I stood next to him. I didn't find him either, he simply said, then began rubbing the back of his neck, a trademark sign he was beginning to stress out. Tell me again the last thing you remember seeing of him, he asked me. I took a deep breath and spoke. Like I said, man, I remember him leaning over me after you'd gone. He leaned down and told me to feel better. Then I heard him run back to the water. I heard him splashing around for a minute. Then I heard a loud splash and then I trailed off as something began to connect in my mind. The jigsaw pieces came together quickly and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the realization hit me. My heart began to beat hard in my chest and I felt the blood begin to drain out of my face as a wave of dread surged into me. Oh shit, Vaughn had caught sight of my face and he grabbed my shoulder to steady me. What, Evan? Then what? My eyes locked with his. I heard a loud splash and then nothing. Silence. My friend's face suddenly went as pale as mine must have looked as he realized what I was saying, and both our gazes swung towards the water. The waves lapped gently on the shore. No sign of movement came from it. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Oh, fuck. And then the two of us began running for the water, shouting Theo's name. Neither one of us bothered to pull off our shirts. We hit the water hard. I nearly tripped as a particularly large swell smacked me in the knees, and I swung my gaze around, seeing nothing. The mental image of my friend's drowned body, hovering just above the sandy bottom, flashed in my mind's eye for a moment, and I pushed it away as another wave of fear rolled into me. You gotta keep calm, man. A hand fell on my shoulder, and I turned, snapping myself out of my thoughts to see Vaughn beside me, his face now set in steely determination. We've gotta split up and search. He pointed to the farthest right side of the bay. You take that side and keep calling out to me every so often, whether you find him or not. I'll do the same over here. I nodded, forcing myself to stay as calm as possible as I watched him turn away, lifting his arms out of the water as he began heading towards the other side. I gazed after him for another moment, then turned and began moving in the opposite direction. My eyes, aided by the sunglasses I still had on, stared down into the water, rapidly looking to the left and the right. But I saw nothing but sand and rocks. You find anything? I heard Vaughn call out behind me. No, nothing. My eyes flickered towards the darker shade of the deeper water. He could easily have been pulled out to sea by the tide. After all, you have no idea if there's a riptide in the bay. That thought scared me more than anything. I could easily imagine Theo's corpse drifting in the dark, like the body in the underwater scene from the TV show The Terror. I was beginning to chide myself again when I felt my foot collide with something that half rose out of the bottom, kicking up a large cloud of silt and sand. I could tell by the feeling of it against my foot that it wasn't anything natural. My breath quickened a bit, and I forced myself to stoop down, my hand disappearing into the cloud as it fell around. My chin was touching the water, and I shot my eyes around as I felt my fingers close around it. The same odd feeling I'd had earlier returned. I still couldn't tell what it was, but with every fiber of my being on alert, it felt amplified and thoroughly unpleasant. I stood back up, pulling what I'd uncovered out of the water. A small wave of confusion passed over me as I stared, watching the water drain out of it. What the hell? It was a man's shoe, one of the slip-on types that you'd see people wearing while aboard yachts. It clearly had been sitting on the bottom for a long time, a slimy covering of muck and algae stuck to the top, and the color had begun fading. My gaze looked down into the water to see if its twin lay on the bottom. There was nothing else there. Why didn't the person retrieve their shoe if they lost it? I shook my head suddenly. I needed to focus. Theo's life might depend on it, if he's even still alive. Vaughn called out again. Hey, what'd you find? I turned to see him looking back at me. Nothing of his, just an old shoe. Keep looking. He nodded at me and turned back. I turned, giving the shoe a last look before letting it slip back below the waves. I watched it sink to the bottom, and then I moved forward again. I'd only gone another 15 feet when I heard a loud splash come from somewhere behind me, then nothing. I called out, Hey, you find him? There was no answer. Hey, Vaughn, did you find anything? Still nothing. Another shiver suddenly rolled up my spine, and I turned, beginning to call out again. Dude, did you fight? Vaughn was gone. For a moment, my brain short-circuited, trying to process what I was seeing. What the fuck? I whispered. My brain suddenly computed, and I realized he must have dived underwater for something. A heavy pit settled in my stomach as I realized he might have found our friend, and I prepared myself to see him surface carrying Theo's body, but nobody broke the gently rolling swells. I looked at my watch, seeing that a minute had passed since he'd disappeared. Vaughn, I called out. My voice seemed to echo off the trees and the bay itself, but nobody answered me. I called out again, Vaughn. Then I suddenly felt my heart begin to race again as a new wave of fear surged into me. What happened to him? I began to move towards the left, keeping in line with where I'd last seen him. The largest swell yet smacked into me as I waded as fast as I could go. I suddenly imagined that there was a sharp drop off, and that both of my friends had accidentally fallen into it, getting caught in a riptide which pulled them out to sea into the bottom. My heart was pounding like a drum in my chest, and I was close to hyperventilating. Shit. Finally, I reached where I swore he'd been and looked around. I was standing in water up to my chest, and even with the shirt on, I was beginning to shiver. Nothing moved, and I saw no sign of my friend anywhere. That was when something caught my eye beneath the waves. I turned, trying to distinguish what it was, but the swells had become a bit fiercer, distorting everything. I took a step forwards, squinting my eyes. It remained elusively out of focus, though I could tell it didn't belong, looking much brighter than the surrounding sand. Another step forwards. It became a little clearer, though still unrecognizable. Another large swell smacked into me, and I took a third step forwards. That's when the same feeling I'd had earlier slammed into me like a Kenworth. The same lightning bolt shot up my spine, and I froze. I realized I'd reached the same place I'd had it before as well. As much as I tried forcing myself to move forwards, it was as if some primitive part of my brain refused to allow my body to do so. Finally, I decided to quickly duck under the water to see what I'd spotted. Leaving the sunglasses on, I took a deep breath and slipped beneath the waves. The salt water stung my eyes as I forced them open, the shapes distorted, but much easier to see than from above. I turned to look in the direction I had, seeing it much clearer now. What the hell is that? I allowed myself to float a little closer. The object came into focus. I froze like a statue. For a moment, I wasn't able to move, my eyes locking on it, my brain trying to comprehend what it was, and simultaneously trying to refuse. The feeling I'd felt again returned with a vengeance, along with a new emotion, horror. I shot up, my head breaking the water as I sputtered it from my mouth, and felt my heart thunder in my chest. My eyes widened as I slowly began to back away, locking on what I recognized now. It was a human leg. To be more specific, it was Vaughn's leg. The tattoo wrapped around the ankle was proof of that. It lay on the bottom, and from what I saw, it ended by the upper thigh. My eyes flashed around, looking frantically at the water around me. Fear like I'd never felt kept crashing into me in bigger and bigger waves. A shark. There's a damn shark in here, and it just killed both my friends. The thought spurred me to take another step backwards. As I did, the thought occurred to me to look for any pools of blood. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally step into one. I looked back at the leg, my eyes following up the calf, to the knee, to the leg moved. I froze again. Why? For a moment, I stared, wondering if it was an involuntary twitch. Then, the leg began to thrash, kicking out hard, almost frantically. There was no way it would be able to do that unless it was still attached to the body. My eyes again moved up the leg towards the thigh, and I suddenly felt as if the wind had been knocked out of me. Vaughn's leg disappeared into the mucky bottom of the bay. As I stared, something began to take shape. Something my eyes hadn't caught before, and I felt a new wave of horror and dread hit me as I realized what I was seeing. A line in the muck, one that seemed about 3 or 4 feet across, one that I realized had teeth poking out from either side of it. Sharp, translucent, needle-like teeth. That wasn't the thing that made me want to scream, though. 2 eyes stared out at me from just above it, ones that almost perfectly blended in with the bottom, if not for the black pupils that gazed coldly up at me. The mouth opened slightly, and I felt a bit of suction, almost pulling me off my feet. I watched, petrified as Vaughn's leg, which for a split second I saw was still attached to him, was sucked inside, the foot giving one final, pathetic kick as the mouth closed over it. It was a sight that, all these months later, I still see in my nightmares. My body shook violently and every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of the water, but I was literally rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. I felt like the character in a horror movie, the kind you screamed at to move as the killer advanced on them and never moved. Something to my right caught my eye, a small movement. I turned, and for a moment didn't understand what I was seeing, and then I was suddenly racing towards the beach, the water maddeningly slowing me. I felt a suction pull on my legs and a loud splash emanate from behind me, but I forced myself to fight it. The water became shallow, and as soon as it reached my knees, I began running. A strange sound suddenly reached my ears, and for a moment, my mind couldn't comprehend what it was. And then I realized, screams, my screams. It's been almost 6 months since I tore from the water that morning. As soon as I was free of the waves, I sprinted for the parking lot, stopping only to snatch up the keys to Vaughn's Jeep. I'd been delirious as I'd crashed through the bushes. According to the hiker who'd found me frantically trying to unlock the driver's door, I'd barely been able to speak, but when I babbled about my friends and the water, he'd called the cops. When they'd come, I'd calm down just enough to be able to tell them what happened. They, of course, didn't believe me. They thought I'd had a mental break. They searched the beach, even bringing a diver in to check the bay, but they found nothing. No sign of Vaughn or Theo, and no monster buried in the sand and muck. Only depressions which the diver noted looked a bit unnatural. The police chalked my friends' fates up to either drowning or a shark attack. For such a small town, it surprisingly didn't even make the local paper, and when Theo's girlfriend arrived when the police called her, they barely answered any of her questions. She was forced to go through the most basic procedures before being hurried out the door, and since Vaughn's parents died 3 years ago, there was nobody they could call for him. I can only assume that the people in charge of government in Owl's Head didn't want the idea of 2 people dying at their secluded, paradise-like beach to stain the town's reputation. Bastards. As for me, as soon as I was released, I flew straight back to Washington. I've tried to get back to as normal a life as possible, but it's been impossible. When I need to report to my clients in Seattle, I now video call them instead of traveling there myself. I tried one time, but as soon as my eyes spied the massive ocean stretching out away from it, I began to shake so badly that I had to pull over. I can't stand to even see the ocean anymore. Hell, I can't even stand to be near a fucking lake. Not without being reduced to a screaming, blubbering mess. I know what it was. Growing up, I'd always gone to the Boston Aquarium during summer vacation with my mother. I'd wanted to be a marine biologist for a time, and I begged her to take me to see all the creatures I used to adore. And I remember staring into one particular tank, watching a monstrous-looking fish bury itself into the sand, waiting for prey to swim by so it could leap up and grab them before swallowing them whole. One that was only about 3 feet long, 5 times smaller than the horror I saw that day, and looking to the plaque mounted on the wall beside the glass, seeing the name, Stargazer, I suffer nightmares every single time I fall asleep. Nightmares of seeing my friend being eaten alive, disappearing into that mouth, one as wide as a dinner table. Nightmares of seeing those cold eyes gazing at me, eyeing me like I was a Thanksgiving turkey, and nightmares of turning to see the second one rising from the bottom, getting ready to strike at me. The few people I tried to tell about what I saw that day, scientists and marine biologists, never believed me, saying that those fish could never grow to such sizes. And now, I finally decided to post what happened that day here, in a place others tell of unbelievable and horrific things that no one believes. I don't care if nobody believes me here either. I need to warn you. Warn as many people as I can. There are horrific things that prowl the ocean. Things that scientists haven't seen yet. Things that nobody has seen yet. Seen and lived to tell about. Anyways, even if you don't believe me, please, at least be wary when you go to the beach. Be vigilant when you wade into the water to have fun with your friends or family, because it's not just the deep ocean you should be afraid of. If you're seeing this, then that means the prayer that I've been making with every single ounce of hope left in my body has been answered, thank God. I've been trying for the last 3.5 hours to get through any way possible to the outside world, with no luck. I'm no computer expert, but the water damage my laptop has suffered must have fucked up the satellite link up something fierce. Any attempt to reach any website, be it the official Coast Guard one or even most social media sites like Facebook or Twitter, have all yielded with the computer crashing and rebooting. But, for reasons unknown to me, Reddit, or I should be more specific and say this particular page on Reddit managed to load perfectly without any issues. So, I'm asking here and now if anyone reads this for help. For the record, my name is Nathan Rogers. I'm 33 years old, and I was the helmsman of a fishing vessel called the Point of No Return. I say was because currently she's thousands of feet beneath my feet in the churning surface of the North Atlantic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In case anything happens to us before anyone reads this or I permanently lose connection, I should give as much of a detailed account as I can. That way, someone might know where to find us or at least know what happened. We left our home port of Portsmouth, New Hampshire about a week and a half ago, bound for the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland. The Point of No Return is a long liner, and our aim was mainly to catch swordfish along with cod and haddock. The prime season for a good haul was closing, and with our haul during the summer falling short of our usual quota, we decided to make one final run to try and make some extra dough. When we arrived, we started off hauling in many good-sized fish. Everyone was happy. Woo, hell yeah, that's what I'm talking about, called Spencer, the youngest member of our crew, as the first fish was hauled on board. But it was short-lived. After a few days, we began to fail to catch anything. It was as if all the fish had disappeared from the area. With our holds not even a quarter full, Gabe, our captain, made the call to sail even farther east, to the Flemish Cap. Thanks to a few of us making the mistake of watching the perfect storm to pass the time on the trip out, a few of us understandably had reservations about going so far from any land mass, but the captain pointed out the obvious. "Boys, I wish it weren't necessary to do," he began, rubbing his thick white beard, "but it's either try the Cap or go home broke." He looked to the sky, which looked clear. Besides, the radar says there shouldn't be any storms for the duration of our trip. Up until now, I've never believed in the concept of jinxing, but I can't help but swear that he jinxed the hell out of us with those words. We made way for the Cap and reached it about a day or so later. To our shock, and of course our elation, we began to haul in a metric fuck ton of fish. Any apprehensiveness we had melted away like butter in a pan, and we all became infected by the thought of how much money we were going to make. Until, that is, the dark clouds began to move in on the horizon. I'd been at my station at the helm, and I looked out the starboard windows to see the ominous darkness rolling towards us. What the hell? According to the weather reports, the nearest storm was hundreds of miles away, and yet, here I was staring one dead in the face. "You gotta be fucking kidding me," I muttered, flicking on the ship's autopilot and walking for the door that led outside. I pushed it open, the thick smell of the ocean and fish wafting over me. Looking down at the aft deck, I saw the captain helping the others ready the lines for their next drop. "Hey, Cap," I yelled out, raising my voice to be heard above the boombox blasting out hard rock music. He glanced up, shielding his eyes so he could see me better. I stabbed my finger towards the gathering storm, which occasionally flashed with lightning. I still perfectly remember how the captain's face filled with shock and surprise as he turned to see it. The rest of the crew turned and spotted it as well. "Oh, that's just great. Will," another of our crew shouted out exasperatedly, dropping the hooks and lines to the deck. The rest of the crew let our curses and some turned to the captain, asking him questions I couldn't hear over the music. After speaking to them for a minute, he walked over and turned off the boombox before making his way up the steps to stand beside me. "Where exactly in the hell did that come from?" he muttered, pulling his hat off his head and scratching at the tufts of gray hair that remained there. "I don't know, sir," I admitted, watching another bolt of lightning flash inside it. "All I know is I was at my station looking around. One minute I don't see it, and the next, I trailed off." I followed the man back into the wheelhouse as he walked to the radar display. For a moment, he stared down at it, then lightly began to smack it. "Piece of shit," he growled. "What's wrong?" I asked him. He gestured to the screen. "The stupid radar must be on the fritz again. It doesn't show the storm on the radar at all." A small wave of confusion swept over me. I'd personally repaired the system the last time it wonked out, and as far as I knew, it had been working perfectly. But as I stepped next to him, I saw he was right. No storm clouds were displayed on the radar in the direction the storm was coming from. What the? A shiver rushed up my spine, one I didn't understand why I had. The cabin was warm and comfortable, and yet it felt as if I'd just walked through thick fog. Finding my voice, I looked at the captain, who held a thoughtful gaze. "So, what do we do?" He took a second to answer, then sighed. "I'm not gonna risk you boys or my ship, especially not after we have a good catch in the hold. Start plotting us a course back to Portsmouth. Hopefully we'll manage to stay just ahead of the storm." And with that, he turned and left the wheelhouse, heading back outside to help the others store the gear in preparation for our departure. I could hear the faint sound of them yelling to each other as they rushed about, the music playing again as well. I walked to the starboard windows and gazed out. The storm appeared closer now, the lightning flashes becoming more frequent. A particularly bright flash came, and for a moment, my eyes locked on a particular cloud formation that had been silhouetted in it. I blinked my eyes rapidly, the rational side of my brain attempting to wrangle in the other. "No, there's no way you just saw that. You know full well storms play tricks on your eyes." Shaking my head, I returned to the helm, turning off the autopilot and nudging the throttle forwards, hearing the rumble of the engines increase. I kept telling myself that I'd been seeing things, but another shiver ran up my spine as I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The image of a cloud, formed into the shape of a human skull. We only made it about 7 or 8 miles west when the storm overtook us. I've been on the water my entire life, and been fishing on commercial vessels since I was 18 years old. I've seen many strange and sometimes unexplainable things, and I've seen my fair share of storms, some very bad. But I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I've never seen a storm as fierce as this one. 20 minutes after the dark gray, almost black clouds slid over my head, the point of no return was being hammered by 12 to 14 foot swells, crashing water onto the deck. The wind howled as fiercely as a banshee, and the world around us turned almost pitch black, the only illumination coming from the almost blinding flashes of lightning which were followed by roars of thunder. I gripped the helm with hands that had begun turning white at the knuckles, bracing my legs for each impact. The captain stood beside me, gripping the metal railing next to the helm to keep from falling. "Just keep going," he yelled to me. Some of the crew stood behind us, staring out at the maelstrom with wide, frightened eyes. It was a fear that I found infectious, for as much as I kept calm, for all outer appearances, inside I was terrified. As horrifying as horror movie monsters are made out to be, they don't hold a candle to the existential dread and terror that Mother Nature at her worst can instill you with. Suddenly, Wyatt, one of our engineers, flew up the stairs from below. "Captain, we're taking on water somewhere, and I can't find the source." I saw many of my crew's faces go pale, but the captain remained calm. "All of you, get below and help Strosky find the source and either patch it or seal it. Then start the pumps to get the water in the boat out." For a moment, nobody moved until he barked again. "Do you want to end up at the bottom of the ocean? Move your asses." I got their attention, and they quickly followed Wyatt down the stairs to the crew quarters and lower decks. As we crested another huge swell, I spared a glance at the radar screen. It still showed no sign of the storm on its green screen as the line made its way around in a circle. I shook my head, feeling a strange feeling, one I couldn't place come over me, but I pushed it away, forcing myself to focus. "Everyone's counting on you, Nate. Keep your head in the game and pray to the good Lord above you make it out of this." I shot a glance at the captain. "You really think we're gonna make it through this, Gabe?" I asked, the seriousness in my using his first name making him look hard at me before clapping a hand on my shoulder. "With a good crew and a terrific man at the helm, son, yes, I do," he declared, pulling out a pipe from his pocket and lighting it. Thick, hazy smoke filled the room as he spoke again. "I've been through far worse than this, after all." Somewhat, I doubted the man's words, but I tried to let them bring some much-needed comfort to me. A large wave crashed over the bow, splashing the front windows with water and obscuring my view ahead for a few moments. When it cleared, the world outside was again pitch black, the outer lights of the boat barely illuminating 20 feet around us. A strong vibration suddenly emanated from the floor beneath my feet, and I shot a glance down at the metal. What the hell was that? My answer was given a moment later as another crew member, Andrew, ran up the stairs. He was soaked with seawater and his eyes darted around in their sockets in a panic. Captain, the pumps are working their hardest, but we're taking on more water than they can expel. We can't find the source of the leak either. The captain cursed, then turned to me. Mathan, hold fast up here and keep us going east. I'm gonna go below and try and help. Not giving me a chance to answer, he turned away, beginning to head towards the companionway stairs. I just turned back to look out the windows when the brightest flash of lightning came, turning the world around us from night to day. It also revealed something dead ahead, something that made my heart almost stop. Oh, fuck my life, I managed out in a whimper. Racing towards the point of no return was a rogue wave, one that dwarfed all the swells around us. My mind screamed at me that it had to be at least 30 or 40 feet high, enough that it blocked out the sky ahead. Captain, I screamed at the top of my lungs. I heard him stop, then the sound of his footsteps as he dashed back next to me. Good God Almighty, I heard him breathe. Nate, turn us broadside into the wave. Our only hope is for us to roll over completely. I turned to see him snatching for the microphone handset, which connected the wheelhouse to the ship's intercom as I began ripping the helm to port. Behind me, I heard Andrew let out a strangled scream as he spied the big wave racing towards us. All hands, we have a rogue wave incoming. Brace for impact. The captain shouted into the mic. Below, I heard the terrified shouts of the crew spring up. I clenched the helm in a death grip as tears silently poured out of my eyes. In my head, the scene from The Perfect Storm flashed, the Andrea Gale being flipped and driven into the ocean. I only had enough time for one quick thought. Please, God, no. The wave smashed into us with all the force of a dozen runaway semi-trucks. The portside windows of the ship shattered into 1,000 pieces, and freezing seawater rushed over us in a seemingly unending wave. For a moment, my mind was unable to comprehend what had happened, and then it began screaming at me as I felt the world begin to rotate. We're fucking underwater. We're flipping underwater in the wave. The realization horrified me, and I felt certain that we would begin sinking like a stone to the bottom of the ocean. I let out a silent prayer for my death to be quick, and then, to my astonishment, we emerged back into the world above the waves. The shock at still being alive froze me in place, and then I looked around. I spied the captain, who'd locked his arms in a death grip around the metal bar next to me. Andrew had been tossed to the back of the wheelhouse. I saw a large gash in his head as he stumbled to his feet, coughing out water. Instantly, the captain ran to the stairs and shouted down them, "Somebody get up here and give me a damage report." As he did, I looked down at the screens in front of me. I felt a wave of despair wash over me as I saw most had short-circuited after their meeting with the ocean. The radar still glowed green, though the screen crackled and flickered as though it would go out at any second. Wyatt appeared at the top of the stairs, blood dripping from his right arm and soaked to the bone. "Give me some good news, Wyatt." The captain yelled over the howl of the wind that screamed into the wheelhouse through the broken windows. To me, it sounded almost more like a plea than a demand. Wyatt shook his head. "The port side engine is dead, sir. Starboard is still running, but barely. Our main generator is dead, and the backup is running everything at full capacity." He let out a shaky breath and looked at the floor before finishing. "And the pumps are dead as well, sir." For a moment, nobody spoke. The implications of the man's words hung like nooses around all our necks. The pumps were dead, and so were we. It was only a matter of time before the ship filled up with too much water and foundered. "We're now running on borrowed time," I thought numbly. When the captain spoke again, his tone was more subdued. "Go down below and tell the men to gather all the emergency supplies they can. Food, water, first aid kits. Have them bring the life raft up and set it down. We'll stay with the ship as long as she'll take us. Then we'll abandon ship into the raft." Wyatt began to speak. "Captain, with all due respect, these waves will tear apart the captain cut him off. "Don't argue with me, just do it," he barked. Wyatt took a step back, then turned wordlessly and headed back down the gangway. He then turned to Andrew, who had begun shaking slightly, a result of both the freezing water covering him and fear. "Andrew, try the radio and send out a distress call." "You know the drill." For a moment, the younger man stood as still as a statue. Then he rushed to the radio and jammed his hand down on the transmit button. "Mayday, Mayday. This is the fishing vessel point of no return. Registration number 57306. We're approximately, I don't know, somewhere of the coast of Newfoundland, and we need urgent assistance. Our ship is taking on water and sinking. Does anyone read me?" I tuned his words out as he began to repeat. turning instead to look out the broken windows. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew we were royally fucked. Wyatt's right, these waves will tear that raft to pieces long before anyone reaches us. The numbness began to spread as I was faced with the unavoidable thought that these might be the final minutes of my life. Moments of my past flashed in front of my eyes. Growing up as a child in Portsmouth, spending weekends at friends of my mother's in Kittery Point, visiting BG's boathouse with my mother and aunt, my relationship with Dana, my ex. A single image suddenly appeared in my mind. My friends and family crowded around a cross commemorating us, crying. My breath began to come in short, ragged gasps as I tried to force away the image. Bang! The sound snapped me out of my inner battle with my mortality, and I blinked for a second. What the? Then it came again. Bang! The realization suddenly crashed into me as hard as the wave had. The radar. Looking down, I watched the flickering screen as the line made its way around again. This time, as the sound rang through the wheelhouse a third time, I saw the large shape appear, and it sent a bolt of renewed hope through me. Captain, I've got something on the radar. The sound of Andrew's distress call stopped as both men turned towards me. I think it's a ship. Instantly the man was at my side, gazing down at the screen. I don't believe it, you're right, he breathed out in an astonished tone. Then he locked eyes with me. Are you thinking what I'm thinking, Nate? He asked. I swallowed. Gabe, right now, there isn't much of an alternative. He looked at me for another second before nodding, then head approximately south-southwest and pour on the power. For the next 20 minutes, we crashed through the storm in silence, aside from Andrew, who'd returned to attempting a distress call. Finally, he gave up. Captain, the rogue wave must have snapped off our radio antenna, he said. Still we continued on. I strained my eyes against the lashing wind and rain pouring through the windows, praying to catch sight of our only chance at survival. And then, in the flash of lightning, I saw it. Even a few miles away from us, I could tell the ship was huge. She rose almost imposingly out of the water, rolling up and down in the waves of the storm. Another flash of lightning showed that her hull was black, while her upper decks were painted white. Two large red and black smokestacks rose into the sky, almost disappearing out of sight. I heard the captain let out a low whistle as he spotted it as well. She's gotta be, 800 feet long? I called over the wind. Try more like 1,000. He yelled back. By now, most of the rest of the crew had reappeared from below deck. They'd brought the gear the captain had ordered up and had packed it into waterproof bags. I'd also requested that the satellite phone and laptop be brought up as well. Unfortunately, the phone was very much dead from being submerged, but the laptop, according to Will, was able to be salvaged. When they caught sight of the giant ship, they let out cheers and turned to hug one another. I realized I hadn't been the only one feeling that death was breathing down our necks. As we drew within half a mile of the ship, I realized something was off. Captain, she's dead in the water, not moving at all, I yelled. If she'd been under power, it would have taken longer to draw near. The captain looked hard, then nodded. You're right, she must have snapped off her mooring lines in the storm somewhere. It's a ghost ship, adrift. I saw the crew's faces fall at the news. So, what do we do now? Kenny, the other engineer, asked. The captain turned to them as I steered us closer. We stick to the plan. We draw alongside her and find a way aboard. We transfer our equipment on board, and then we'll go from there. The look of hope returned in some of their eyes, but I saw apprehension enter others. I didn't blame them one bit. Fear still coursed through my veins. All it takes is one screw up, one mistake, and we're all dead. The captain ordered me to move around to the ship's port side so as to give us a small bit of shelter from the storm. He then snapped on the powerful searchlight, which thankfully hadn't been taken out by the wave, and traced it over the ship. A few minutes later, I heard him let out a triumphant laugh. Mate, move us next to the middle of the ship. There's a ladder dangling there. He was right. I saw the white lines and wooden steps flailing about in the wind. Sparing a glance behind us and seeing that the ocean was beginning to creep over the back of the transom, I hastily moved the point of no return over to the ladder, nudging the throttle into neutral as we drew alongside. Sparing a glance out the open side door, I saw Spencer and Will reaching out with both hooks to snatch the ladder. Yes, the two men hooked it and lashed it to our railing. Okay, one man at a time, get the gear and get up there, he yelled. Slowly, almost painfully, the 8 members of our crew made their way up the ladder and onto the ship. As I watched Wyatt climb out of sight, a sound caught my attention. I looked down to see all of the remaining gauges die, and the sound of the remaining engine idling died away. Crap. Almost immediately afterwards, I became aware of a new sound. It was one that spurred a new wave of panic in me. It was the sucking sound of the sea rapidly flooding the point of no return. "Captain, she's going under," I screamed, snatching up the last bag of supplies. I saw the man give an almost pained look as he cast a final look at the vessel he'd worked his entire life to afford, before shouting at me and Kenny, the last two aboard besides himself. "All right, boys, abandon ship." Kenny went up the ladder first. Unable to wait for him to make it all the way up, the captain and I unsnapped the ladder from our railing and began climbing after him. We were halfway up when I heard the sucking sound increase to a fever pitch. Stopping and sparing a look below me, I saw the point of no return's boat lift out of the water as her stern slipped below the waves. She rapidly began to sink, and I turned to continue climbing. That was when a scream came from overhead. I snapped my gaze up to see a body fall past me, missing me by less than a foot. For a moment, shock kept my mind from working until I realized who I'd seen in the split-second flash of lightning. "Kenny," I screamed out into the dark. But when the lightning flashed again, I saw no sign of him floating in the waves, only the bow of our ship as it finally slipped below the waves. I shouted the man's name again, the wind tearing the cry from my lips and off into the storm. "Nathan, he's gone," came a cry from below me. I shot a look down, seeing the captain looking up at me with a horrified expression. "Get up the ladder," he ordered. I fought my emotions for a moment, then climbed as quickly as I could for the railing. A few moments later, both the captain and I hauled ourselves over, collapsing onto the wooden deck with sputtering coughs and groans. When I raised my head, it was to see the ashen face of Wyatt looking down at us. "Where's Kenny?" he cried. I took in a shaky breath, then shook my head slowly at him. I saw the shock and horror flash into his face. The same happened to all of the men standing behind him. For my part, I simply felt numb. Even though I'd lost my aunt to ovarian cancer in 2009, lost one of my mom's family friends to a brain tumor in 2012, I'd never actually seen someone die before. Not in real life, anyways. My mind was a jumble. I couldn't think properly. Thankfully, though, the captain stood up and spoke up, his voice shaking only for a second before hardening. "As hard as this may be for everyone, we need to get inside and out of the storm. We'll have time to be able to grieve later. Right now, we need to get away from the wind and rain before we catch pneumonia or hypothermia." His words seemed to bolster everyone, even myself, and we all stood, gathering our supplies and moving to find a door inside. After a few minutes searching, we found one, and after snapping on the waterproof flashlights we all had, we stepped inside the ship. Instantly, the sound of the howling wind grew fainter as we found ourselves inside a companionway of some kind. It seemed like it was meant for the crew. It seemed more Spartan in function over form than what I'd seen from the rest of the ship. Nobody said a word as we made our way down until we came to another door. Will, being the first in line, reached out and opened it, and we stepped into what I can only describe as the most luxurious lounge I've ever been in. The walls were plastered with wood that reflected back in the glow of our lights. What appeared to be marble lined the ceiling overhead. I saw dozens on tables and chairs, ones that had once been scattered across the room, lying overturned or on their sides, no doubt thrown about by the storm. Walking further into the room, I turned to the left and aimed my flashlight at the wall, and nearly jumped out of my skin as my light reflected off a huge face that gazed back at me. "Jesus," I shouted, feeling my heart begin a marathon in my chest. What is it?" I heard Andrew call out. All the men ran to me and aimed their lights at what I'd seen. Instantly, the tension that filled the room was replaced by the sounds of laughter. "Fucking hell, Nate. Are you really that afraid of the Queen of England?" Manny, another of our crew, asked as he fought for breath. I let out a shaky breath of my own as I played my light over what I now saw was a painting, one of Queen Elizabeth II. Then I began to laugh along with them. "Good Lord, Nathan, you really are a pussy." For a minute, we all stood there, laughing and feeling the mood lighten somewhat. The levity helped lighten the sadness that we all felt. It was cut short by the captain's voice as a loud rumble of thunder came from outside. "All right, everyone, change into dry clothes and break out the sleeping bags. Then get some sleep. This has been one of the worst days of our lives. We need to rest. Tomorrow, we'll take stock of the ship and figure out what to do next." And with that, everyone began to fan out, finding a lone corner to change in without being seen. As they did, I approached the captain. "Gabe," I said, tapping the man on the shoulder. He turned to look at me and I instantly saw the haunted look in his eyes. The poor man blames himself for Kenny. I wanted to say something, say that it wasn't his fault. Instead, I told him I wanted to stay up a little, get the laptop out, and try and get a signal from the satellite connection to try and find a way to send out a call for help. After a moment's hesitation, he agreed, gesturing towards the vast amount of chairs and tables. "Go ahead, just try and get some sleep afterwards," I nodded, then patted him again on the shoulder before turning away. That's where I am now. I changed into dry clothes and found a thick, cushioned armchair on its side. I sat it upright, then pulled out the laptop. The battery was, thankfully, fully charged, and I have a solar charger if it gets low, which survived. But, as I said at the start, it had to have sustained some kind of water damage because it won't let me go to many, if any, sites. Only this one. I'm the only one of us left awake now. All around me I can hear the snores of my fellow crew members, hear them rolling over to get comfortable on the carpeted floors. I still hear the rain pounding on the roof of the great ship, hear the thunder rumble, and feel the ship lurching up and down in the waves. I pray she doesn't hit any rocks during the night. We don't need another problem on our hands. There is one final thing I have to say, though I can't help but feel foolish about it. I know that we're the only ones on board. Otherwise, people would have already come by now. We'd be swarmed with crew or passengers. And yet, I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. I know, it's ridiculous, but I can't make the feeling go away. I feel like a goldfish with its owner staring in at me, and I don't like it one bit. I even took a walk around outside this lounge to reassure myself nobody else is here. I know the captain wouldn't have liked me doing so, but I wouldn't have been able to sleep otherwise. If anyone reads this, can anyone help us? We're only fishermen who have dealt with a 70 feet long liner, not a giant cruise ship or ocean liner. Does anyone know what we have to do to get power going again? Where we have to go? If we can get power restored, we might be able to get the radio on board working again and let people know we're out here. And is there anything else important we should do tomorrow? Anything at all that you can think of? Please let me know if anyone sees this. I'll check back in the morning to see if anyone has. Oh, and one final thing. I don't know if it'll help, but when I went for my walk to prove to myself nobody else is here, I found a life ring which had the name of this ship stamped into it. Maybe someone can look to see if the ship has been labeled missing or something, which would work to try and get someone to know where we are. The name of the ship bears the same name as the huge, almost creepy looking painting on the wall that, in the dark, I try not to look at. RMS Queen Elizabeth. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. Years of therapy haven't helped. I can still remember every detail as though I'm still right there. All around me the freezing water stretching on, unbroken for miles in every direction, its icy chill stabbing at my skin. Nothing but pure darkness beneath me, my feet the only thing visible before the dark abyss. The sounds of my friends' screams as that looming shadow made its way towards each of them one by one. Even if I close my eyes, those images are still there. I've not been on another fishing trip since then. Hell, I've not even been to the beach since then. Even the idea of going to a swimming pool sends bolts of anxiety through me. The whole thing was a disaster. It was a few years ago now that Tom, my best friend at the time, decided to organize that fateful trip. We tried to do something like that every year, a big holiday where we would all meet up and do something together for the week. We all had busy lives with work and family, so this was our way of keeping the friendship alive. Every year we'd take it in turns to plan where we were going and what we were doing, and this year the crown of responsibility fell to Tom. The group chat pinged back and forth as Tom revealed his grand plan for this year's trip. Sea fishing. It'll be fun. A boat, the 5 of us, some cold brews and fresh fish. What's not to love? His message read. I wasn't an avid fisher myself, although I was up for trying just about anything. Tom and Gavin were seasoned anglers. John and Jenny were less than enthusiastic about the fishing aspect of the trip, but I'd never known them to pass up a few beers with good friends. After a bit of deliberation, Jenny questioning if maybe we could just do a beach week and Tom fish from the shore instead. Gavin applauding the choice and sending a picture of himself already in his fishing gear ready to go, and Tom telling Jenny that a beach fishing trip would be shit. It was decided. We were going ocean fishing. A few days later, Tom sent us the postcode for where we were going, as well as a screenshot of the address of the boat hire that he'd booked us in within the time that we had the vessel from. "See you there, losers," captioned the screenshot. I searched the place online, curious as to what kind of boat we would be spending the week on. Several different shapes and sizes of boats were presented to me, varying from smaller two-man boats to something akin to a super yacht. Each of them looked well kept and worth more money than I could hope to earn in 10 years. Excitement welled up in me as I imagined lazing on the deck under the sun, the ocean waves gently rocking the boat, a cold brew in hand, chatting and laughing with my friends. Next week couldn't come soon enough. I made my way down to the shore that following week. The journey was always the worst part of these trips. We all lived in different areas of the country, so if it wasn't your year to plan the trip, you were bound to be traveling. After hours of driving down the same monotonous strip of motorway, a sight greeted my eyes that raised my spirits significantly: the ocean. I could see its majestic blue reaching for the horizon several fields over. I was nearly there. Taking the next exit off the motorway, I drove for another 10 minutes until the boat rental appeared on my left, and the sat-nav told me that I'd arrived at my destination. Pulling into the car park of the place, I could clearly see the fleet of flashy, brilliant white boats bobbing gently in the waves. They were beautiful, and a sense of anticipation rose in me as I wondered which one would be ours for the week. The sounds of birds and the lapping surf greeted my ears as I stopped the car's engine and opened the door, my legs thankful at a chance to stretch after the painful hours of driving. As I stood, the breeze gently rustling my hair, I heard another sound which caused me to spin around. Well, look who it is. Tom, who had been standing by the entrance to the hire office, was charging across the car park towards me, a large grin covering his face. Before I knew it, he'd embraced me in a massive hug, the kind of spine-crushing embrace that is only reserved for long-lost friends and near-death experiences. "Whoa, dude, put me down," I managed to squeeze out, along with the rest of the air being forced from my lungs. "It's good to see you, but I'd rather not spend the week in intensive care." "Haha, sorry man, I just get so excited for these trips. It feels like ages since we've done this," said Tom, putting me back onto solid ground. He was a full foot taller than me and built like a strongman. Sometimes I think he forgot exactly how strong he was. "So where is everyone? Am I the first one here?" I asked, glancing around. "You wish, mate. Everyone's waiting for you," Tom said, gesturing to the office behind him. With another mischievous grin, he continued, "We'd been contemplating just leaving and picking you up when we had to stop for fuel. Whatever, you guys love me too much to leave me stranded on the shore like some landlubber," I said, laughing as I made my way to the office. Tom stepped behind me. As I opened the door to the office, I was greeted by the collective cheers of Gavin, John, and Jenny. "You finally made it," Gavin shouted, a smile across his face. "We thought you got lost or something. I was deciding if I could stand spending another week with you guys." "I'm still not sure, to be honest," I said, jokingly. Although we'd not seen much of one another since last year's trip, in the few minutes I'd been here it felt as though we hadn't been apart. Tom was speaking to the hire manager, eagerly getting the boat sorted, and grinning back at us. Gavin was teasing John about his new tattoo that was supposed to be a symbol from his favorite band but looked like the artist had done it blindfolded, and Jenny was laughing along to their back and forth, messing with the camera that she'd brought with her to capture the memories in digital form. After a couple of minutes, Tom came back over with a set of keys in his hands. "Follow me, my fellow adventurers, and I shall lead you to our mighty vessel." Gathering our things, we followed Tom out onto the dock. We made our way past several boats, Gavin stumbling and nearly dropping a large bag of his fishing gear into the waters below, before we stopped in front of one of the largest yachts I had ever laid eyes on. The thing was huge, gleaming white, with dark highlights and several clear glass windows. The interior was made of varnished wood and expensive-looking upholstery. There was a fancy, modern-looking fire pit in the center of what I assumed were the living quarters, and I could see a corridor leading off behind it that I assumed led to the bedroom. It was beautiful, far better than the ragtag tub that I was expecting Tom to have hired. "Welcome," Tom said, opening his arms in a triumphant gesture, looking at each of our amazed faces. We each made our way aboard, gawking at the beauty of the boat. "How much was this, mate? Seriously, it looks like the yachts you see billionaires on," I asked. "Don't you worry yourself, Mom and Dad are covering this. They wanted to do something nice for me, so it's not costing me a penny. That being said, don't get trashing the place." We each made our way to the back of the yacht, through the corridor that led to the bedrooms. Gavin and Jenny argued about who would get the room closest to the living quarters while the rest of us stowed our gear and made our way up onto the main deck. As I climbed the short ladder to the main upper deck, I felt the breeze from the ocean gently rippling through my clothes, and I couldn't help but feel content. This trip was going to be amazing. I could feel it. Tom was already by the helm, starting the boat's engine and turning us around to begin making our way out of the dock. "So, where we be headed then, Captain?" I asked in a pirate voice, raising a hand to my forehead in a mock salute. "Well," said Tom, chuckling, "there's this spot I've heard of, supposed to be an amazing fishing spot. It's surrounded by a reef so none of the larger boats go anywhere near it, and it's far enough out that nobody normally tries fishing there, at least not if you're only out for the night." Turning back around, he grinned. "Luckily we won't have that problem. It'll be just us and the fish, nothing to scare them off. Don't worry, mate. The sight of your face will be enough to scare them away anyway," I said as Tom flipped me the middle finger. After a couple of hours, Tom killed the engine, the boat rocking gently on the calm surface. "This is it. Weigh anchor," he exclaimed as he pressed the button to drop the boat's anchor, the chain rattling as the heavy weight sank into the depths. We all glanced around at our surroundings. We were in the middle of nowhere, the deep blue of the sea extending on for miles until it merged with the horizon. Gavin, John, and Jenny mirrored my confused expression. "Wow, this is awesome," John said, obviously confused and disappointed. "Look, I know it doesn't look like much, but we'll get tons of fish here, trust me," Tom retorted. "Okay, we best do, buddy, or this is going to be a long week." So we set up our fishing gear, bought up a cooler of beers, and cracked a few open while Tom explained the basics of fishing to John and Jenny. Within an hour we were all sitting around, a couple of beers deep, joking with one another and reminiscing. We were in it for the long haul. Laughter filled the air as Gavin relayed stories of his recent jobs and Jenny described her drunken antics at her university parties. One particular incident involved several traffic cones and being chased across her local park by police. Her story ended with her hiding in the bushes just outside of her house, waiting for them to leave. Everyone was in hysterics, imagining her attempting to poorly hide in a bush while a police officer scoured the area. Eventually, as the night went on, the laughter began to slowly ebb away with the daylight, gradually being replaced by drunken tiredness. "Where are these fish, dude? I don't think I've seen so much as an empty snack wrapper, let alone anything alive," slurred Gavin. "Yeah, I thought you said this was a good spot, Tom," I said. "Where did you even find out about this place?" Tom looked at me sheepishly. "Well, I was on 4chan, talking about fishing with some randoms, when one of them told me about this place." 4chan? Seriously? You based this entire trip on the good faith of some random on 4chan? I said, attempting to mask the annoyance in my voice. "Just give it time," everything online pointed to. The yacht jolted violently to the right with a deafening impact, cutting Tom off mid-sentence. We all staggered across the deck, thrown violently by the force of what I could only assume was something large and solid colliding with the side of our yacht. "What the hell was that? Did we just crash?" yelled Jenny, trying to get to her feet. "We haven't moved, the anchor is down. Something must have hit us," Tom shouted back, a panicked expression drawing across his face. "What do you mean something hit us? We've not seen so much as a fish all day, and now there is something here, it's attacking us." "What are you on about?" John cried out. Amongst the shouting and arguing going on behind me, I couldn't help but find my eyes drawn to the water. I'd managed to catch myself on one of the railings when the boat lurched, so I was facing out to sea, away from the shouting match currently going on between my friends. As I gazed into that dark abyss, barely able to penetrate its surface, I couldn't help but stare at a patch that seemed darker than the rest. I put it down to it being dark and me being drunk, but I swear it looked like it was moving, slowly circling the boat. It was massive. I watched it in silence, the sound of my friends being reduced to mere background noise. It was moving and was definitely circling us. What the hell was it? I was about to shout to my friends when the shape seemed to break from its current trajectory, turning to face us and accelerating with lightning speed. "Guys, watch out," was all I managed to shout before another powerful impact rocked the yacht, sending me sprawling across the deck. The sound of the almighty slam was accompanied by the equally deafening shattering of wood and rushing water. Whatever that was, it must have breached the hull. The air was filled with angry, confused shouts as well as those of fear. I whirled around to see Tom and Gavin, already back on their feet, rushing to the ladder that would take them to the lower deck. They'd obviously heard the shattering sound too, and were well on their way to check it out. Pulling myself up as fast as I could, I ran to the ladder, fueled by panic and adrenaline. There was no way I wanted to end up shipwrecked out here. The confused and scared shouts of John and Jenny followed me as I climbed down the ladder, scanning the sea for any sign of that dark shape that I'd seen barreling towards us. I half expected to see it lining up for another killing blow. The sea was empty, still as it had been all afternoon. There were no signs of a darker shape moving around, although the water was so dark that it was hard to tell. Tom and Gavin were at the far end of the lower deck, or what was left of it at least. Where the stern had once been, there was now just a dark ocean filling the gaping hole, shattered beams of timber poked out at unnatural angles, forcibly torn from the rest of the vessel. "What the hell?" Tom said, the panic audible in his voice. "What the hell happened? What could do that?" "Shut up and help me with the buckets. I don't want to sink." "We need to bail," now Gavin yelled, trying in vain to frantically throw the water that was now gradually consuming the deck back into the darkness beyond. Tom and I jumped to Gavin's side, each grabbing a bucket from a nearby cupboard and trying desperately to prevent the inevitable advance of the oncoming ocean. With each bucket full that I tossed overboard, I could feel the water around my feet beginning to rise, along with the gradient of the yacht. This was useless. There was nothing we could do. "This isn't working. We need to get to higher ground and come up with a plan. We're sinking," I yelled before turning and beginning to climb the ladder to the main deck. Just as I was about to reach the main deck, all hell broke loose. The world seemed to spin as I felt myself rising into the air, still clinging to the rungs of the metal ladder. The very being of the yacht shuddered and rising amongst the screams and cries of my friends. A sickening crack muffled all other sounds. All that I could feel was the wind rushing past my face as I tumbled through the air, still clinging to the ladder. Then the sickening, icy cold of the sea enveloped me. With an almighty crash, I landed beneath the waves. Releasing the ladder and kicking frantically, I powered my way back to the surface. I had no idea what had happened. The cold had knocked the wind from me. I needed to get air, to breathe. Breaching the surface, it was as though someone had unmuted the world. The sloshing of waves against what looked to be debris combined with the frantic screaming of my friends was the first thing to snap me out of my stunned stupor. The second thing, the thing that sobered me up completely within a matter of seconds, was what remained of the yacht. Standing upright in the water and slowly descending, it looked as though the bow had also been sheared clean away from the rest of the vessel, leaving it an eviscerated husk. As it was slowly consumed, vanishing out of sight from the waves, I was suddenly able to piece together what had happened. Whatever had taken the stern had come back for the bow. It must have taken it clean off, and the yacht not being supported, threw us off into the ocean with whatever it was. As I struggled to keep my head above water, the shouts of my friends became clearer and a chill ran down my spine as I heard their confused, terrified voices. "Are you guys okay? What happened? Where's Gavin? Something in the water. What the fuck is that?" I whirled around, looking for any sign of that thing, of a dark moving shape headed towards us. There was nothing, but now that I was in the water, it all looked the same anyway. That shape could be sitting a few yards away, and I'd have missed it. Spinning frantically, I looked for any sign of Gavin. The others were shouting for him, and I hadn't seen him since I resurfaced. There was no sign of him, nothing amongst the debris that separated us. If he'd fallen under and gotten trapped, we'd never know. My heart sank as I imagined him sinking, flailing frantically as he was dragged further and further beneath the waves, dragged down into the depths with the yacht. Then, in the distance, I saw something that snapped me back to my current, dire situation. I only caught a glimpse of it, but that was all I needed to see to start frantically swimming to the nearest piece of debris. I screamed to my friends that we all needed to get out of the water, get onto whatever debris we could, and just get out of the water. The image of that monstrous fin, tattered and gray with thick green scars, disappearing beneath the water near the yacht, was all I could think about. I'd only seen it for a second, but it was long enough for me to know that whatever it belonged to was huge. I pulled myself up onto a large section of the now detached hull, my wet hands struggling for purchase against its smooth surface. As I struggled to scramble to its apex, I turned, desperate to see if my friends had followed my terrified instructions. From the slight elevation of this point, I could clearly make them out in the black darkness. John and Jenny had already managed to find something to climb onto, the severed segments of what used to be the deck, lifelessly floating in the waves. Their heads were spinning, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. Then a shrill, ear-piercing scream from my left caused the blood to drain my face. I snapped my head around to see Tom, still there in the black waters, swimming towards me. His face was pale and the expression of panic that coated it earlier now seemed to have evolved into that of full-blown fear. He was swimming frantically, dragging one of his legs behind him. Something just bit my leg. "There's something in the water," he screamed, throwing himself as hard as he could through the vast expanse of water between us. Anchoring myself to my floating sanctuary, I reached out my other arm, as futile as it seemed, almost willing it to stretch to Tom, to pull him into safety. He stared at me as he was swimming, his wild eyes frantically flicking between mine and the ocean around him, his look almost pleading with me to get him out. "Come on, dude, you're almost there, just swim, eh?" My words fell short as I caught a glimpse of something moving in Tom's wake. A huge, dark shape, gaining fast on my injured friend. "Tom, move, now, just goddamn swim as hard as you can," I bellowed as I watched the dark shape closing the distance between it and my best friend. Then all of my strength left me and I felt my arm slowly dip into the freezing waters, unable to support it. From behind Tom, a thin, slimy tendril gently breached the surface. Its long, gray and green body slowly extended from out of the abyss, terminating in a branching mass of four spindly feelers. It seemed to swing back and forth silently, almost scenting the air as it gradually got closer and closer to my friend. "Tom, get out now, swim," I yelled, absolute fear now drawn tightly across my face. The tendril seemed to slowly reach out towards Tom, silently shifting through the water behind him. As it made contact with his leg, it seemed to briefly caress him, as though examining him to find out exactly what he was. Tom's face changed from one of fear to absolute horror and disgust. "What the hell is that?" he said, whirling around in the water to face the slimy abomination that had worked its way up to his back. Then he screamed. He screamed the loudest, most horrified scream I think I've ever heard anyone scream. I'll never forget that sound for as long as I live. As though pained by the screech, the tendril withdrew slightly before shooting back towards Tom with lightning speed, wrapping itself tightly around his neck, the four feelers covering his mouth. Tom's face was now a mask of abject terror, his eyes frantically whirling around, looking for anything, any way out of this hell. His eyes briefly locked with mine and I could see the absolute terror, the pleading fear within them, before a violent jerk from the tendril pulled Tom's head beneath the surface. The last thing I ever saw of Tom, of my best friend, was him frantically kicking and flailing, grappling with the tentacle that was slowly suffocating him, before he vanished from my sight into the dark blackness of the abyss below. My best friend, gone, just like that. This couldn't have been happening. It had to be some kind of nightmare. Rage began to well up from deep within me, and I let out a pained roar before falling back to the section of deck. Fiery tears welled up in my eyes as the image of Tom's horrified face stared back at me in my mind's eye. I should have helped him. I should have jumped in, tried to pull the tentacle off, get him to safety. I should have done something, not just sit here and stare. He was my best friend, for God's sake. Shaking, I looked around, hearing shouts from John and Jenny. What happened? Where's Tom? It was like I was listening through a layer of cotton wool, like all of the sounds around me had been muffled. It took a great deal of effort to shake off the images of Tom being dragged below, but right now, I needed to focus on John and Jenny. We were still stuck here, we still needed to find a way out. "He's gone," I yelled back, wiping the tears from my eyes. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" John shouted back angrily. "Oh God, no, this can't be happening," Jenny shouted, before sinking to her knees, her head in her hands. I knew she'd always had a thing for Tom, even if she'd never told any of us specifically. Sometimes you could just tell. She was as devastated as I was, staring blankly at her shoes. Something took him. "Look, just stay away from the water. Just stay where you are, and we can figure something out." I shouted, trying my best to sound confident, my insides feeling like they were squirming. In truth, I had no idea what we could do. Our yacht was trashed, there was no one for miles in any direction, and hypothermia was likely to set in long before we'd be able to paddle our chunks of debris anywhere close to land. And then there was this thing in the water, this huge, unknown thing. It had taken Tom, and with a chilling realization, I realized it had probably taken Gavin too. Who knows how long it was going to hang around, waiting for the rest of us. Sitting there in the dark, floating on a tiny speck of decking, I couldn't help but feel completely helpless. Giving into my despair, I broke down, letting myself cry. Each tear added to the freezing layer of water that already coated my body. I knew it wouldn't be long until I began shutting down, the cold slowing me to the point that I'd simply cease to survive, another floating meal for hungry fish and seabirds. There were only the three of us left now, me, John, and Jenny, three small people trapped in the giant, never-ending expanse of the endless open ocean. No one would even know where we were. Once we failed to return at the end of the week, the rental company would call the Coast Guard. They'd come and look as best as they could, but no one really knew about this place. Tom said so himself. After another few days, they'd call off the search and assume we were lost at sea. There was no help coming. Guys, did any of you see that? John's voice pulled me from the depths of my despair. He was standing on his mound of debris, pointing to a spot just in front of him. It looked like John's words were abruptly cut short as his floating debris sanctuary was knocked violently from under him, landing in the icy water with a loud splash. Jenny and I both called out to him, frantically urging him to get back to safety, get out of the water. His head broke the surface, terrified and frantic, looking around for anything to clamber onto, and whatever had knocked him off in the first place. He'd been there for nearly 5 seconds, frantically splashing and turning, when he was violently yanked beneath the waves. Water filled his lungs, cutting off the sound of his final terrified scream. Jenny and I both yelled out, screaming in terror as we watched the bubbles where John had been slowly tapering out, getting weaker and weaker before stopping completely. This could not be happening. This thing, it was picking us off, one by one. Jenny and I were the last ones left, but who knew how long that thing would wait before coming back for us? All we could do was stare at each other across the waves, wide-eyed, numb, defeated. Despair settled over us both again as we resigned ourselves to our fate. Even if someone did stumble upon us, neither of us would likely be rescued. All that would be found would be the remnants of the decimated yacht. No one would know what had happened here. Jenny's frantic screaming filled the air, cutting through my thoughts like a knife. I turned to her, awestruck and terrified as the platform she was standing on was being slowly dragged away. She was staring, wide-eyed, screaming at the water beneath her. Completely helpless, I saw the dark shape that was clearly visible beneath her platform, pushing it away from the rest of the debris, despite being dragged further away from me. Her screams reached an almost deafening crescendo as 4 of the monstrous slimy tendrils gently breached the surface. They slowly reached forward, slithering through the air like unnatural floating snakes, feeling their way towards the floating debris. As they make contact with the wood, they latch on with surprising strength, the crushing sound of splintering wood, loud enough to be heard throughout Jenny's now hysterical screams. Then, a crushing wave of realization hit me as it began to tear away chunks of Jenny's sanctuary, hurling fragments of wood into the waters as it desperately tore away at the floating deck. Jenny's eyes were locked on the scene unfolding in front of her. She'd stopped screaming now. She looked almost like she was in shock, not believing that any of this could possibly be happening, hoping that it had all been a bad dream. I screamed at her to run, to swim to another section of the deck, just swim away from that thing, but she didn't react. She didn't even register my voice. She just stood there, staring. The tendrils violently tore away at the remaining deck, edging ever closer to Jenny until one finally brushed against her leg. All movement stopped as the tendrils ceased their tearing, and for one brief moment, the sea felt calm. Then, before I could even react, 3 of the 4 tendrils flew with lightning speed, shooting out in unison towards Jenny. They wrapped themselves tightly around her neck, arm, and leg before she had a chance to move, to even scream. Their touch snapped her out of her stupor, and she began to scream and writhe, violently kicking and pulling at the tendrils she could reach. Pure survival instinct drove her as she fought to get free before the fourth tendril reached out, the four feelers gripping the top of her head, aggressively throwing her into the air. I watched in unfathomable horror as they violently slammed her down into the floating deck, a sickening crack reverberating in my ears as her head connected with the hardwood of the deck. I only caught a glimpse of her face, the skin on the one side now hanging at an unnatural angle, her nose and mouth streaming blood, before she was taken down into the deep. No sound left her lips as her head vanished beneath the surface, only a short stream of bubbles followed, before coming to a stop. Within a matter of seconds, the sea returned to its calm, still state. Everything was still, there were no sounds other than the lapping of the waves against the flotsam. I was alone, stranded in the middle of the ocean. I was numb. How could this be happening? That thing, it had taken them, taken my friends. How long was it before it came for me? A slight movement to my right caught my attention and a spur of hope raised within me as I saw something rising slowly to the surface. Had Jenny managed to break free from that thing? I watched with bated breath as the pale shape got closer and closer, steadily making its way to the surface. As it got closer, the hopefulness that had begun rising in me slowly ebbed away. It was small, much too small to be Jenny. Perplexed, I watched as it continued rising, getting ever closer. Then horror washed over me. I scrambled backwards across the deck, away from what I could now see clearly as Jenny's severed hand. It breached the surface, rings and bracelets glinting in the moonlight. Floating amongst the debris, I could make out her hand and wrist, clearly leading down towards where her forearm should be, but all that seemed to remain were strands of torn skin, sinuous and raw. They drifted in the water like the tendrils of a grotesque jellyfish. The blood drained from my face, a cold sweat coating my already freezing brow as I vomited. The weight of my situation bore down on me. I was the only one left. They were gone, my friends, all taken, and I was next. It was just a matter of time till that thing came back for me, ready to drag me into the depths. With each passing moment, I could feel the weight of impending doom. That thing was lurking somewhere below, it had to be, circling, waiting. I huddled on the debris, shivering from the cold, my eyes darting across the treacherous expanse, anticipating the next strike, waiting for the nudge to my makeshift raft that would signal my impending death. Jumping every time a wave lapped against any debris in the water, fearing that it was the creature ready to breach the surface again for its final meal. I'd resigned myself to my fate, but the waiting was like torture. My mind started to play tricks on me. I saw shadows further out in the water, large dark spots in the already black sea. They disappeared whenever I focused on them, nothing more than a trick of the light. Sounds met my ears that couldn't possibly be real. My friends crying out, screaming for help, and the crashing sounds of the yacht being torn apart. The chugging of a diesel engine. Why couldn't that thing just take me now and end all of this? I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose as I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the phantom sounds of my memories. Gradually they quietened down, all bar the sound of the diesel engine. If anything, it seemed to be getting louder. I opened my eyes, confused. Scanning around, I could see blinding searchlights in the distance. A boat. There's no way that a boat should have been here, but here it was, plain as day. Hope rose in me again, forcing me to my feet as I began shouting at the top of my lungs, hoping against hope that this wasn't yet another cruel trick of my fracturing mind. Hearing my cries, I was suddenly illuminated by the beam of one of the searchlights, the boat changing course towards me. This is it, I thought. I just need to get on that boat, and then this will all be over just a little longer. I was painfully aware of how exposed I was. That creature could be anywhere. If it attacked before the boat got to me, there would be nothing anyone could do. I would be taken to the depths before anyone could register what happened. Scanning the shipwrecked area again, my heart stalled as I saw it. That same huge fin, gray with green, vein-like scars running through it, was slowly descending below the waves on my left mere feet away. It seemed to be swimming away from me, away from the light. My legs felt weak and began trembling at the thought that the creature had been so close, perhaps only seconds away from ripping me from the surface. After what felt like hours, but in reality was likely just a few minutes, I could clearly make out the boat headed towards me. It was a large, response boat. I could clearly see the symbol for the Coast Guard adorning the side of it. I couldn't help but cry, tears of joy for being saved and sorrow for my friends who I'd never see again. They slowed to a halt just in front of me, the spray from their boat splashing across me. I could smell the diesel fumes from the engine, but to me all that it could smell like was safety. Strong hands reached out, pulling me from the clutches of the ocean's grip, and I collapsed onto the safety of the rescue vessel. Tears mingled with the salt water on my face as I gasped for air, my body trembling with a mixture of relief and profound loss. I was safe. This was really happening. Looking over the side railing, I could see the debris field. What remained of the yacht was strewn as far as I could see, slowly being swallowed by the unforgiving sea. For a moment, only a brief moment, I swear I could see a dark shape just on the edge of the searchlight illuminating the area. It waited there, still, and on the outskirts of the beam. Terror welled up in me as I braced myself, awaiting its attack on the boat, shattering it as easily as it had the yacht. But the inevitable impact never came. The shape remained there, floating, watching, before turning away and disappearing into the black abyss from whence it came. Relief washed over me, cleansing all of the fear and tension, the pain and heartache I'd felt the entire time I'd been stranded in that horrific sea. The weight of the entire ordeal fell onto me, as though dropped from the heavens, no longer held at bay by adrenaline and fear. I collapsed, my body too tired to hold up even a finger. I was violently shivering, crying as one Coast Guard proceeded to wrap me in several blankets, carrying my limp form into the cabin in an attempt to keep hypothermia at bay. As he lowered me to the floor, my face must have still been wearing that same terrified mask it had been contorted into for the past several hours as he held both hands up in a calming gesture, slowly backing away. Easy now, you're safe, don't worry, you're lucky we found you, he said soothingly. Boat hire place said there were 5 of you. Do you know where your friends are? Gone. They're all gone. Leave. Thing took them. Me too. Go. I managed to utter in a broken speech before the weight of that exertion caused me to black out. When I awoke, I was in a hospital on the mainland. I'd been unconscious for a few days and the doctors were not sure if I'd wake back up again. They told me if I'd been in the water for another few hours, then I probably wouldn't be here right now. They didn't know how right they were. Since that fateful night, I have struggled to make sense of what transpired. I carry the weight of survivor's guilt, haunted by the faces of my friends, their horrified expressions and ear-shattering screams ever present whenever I close my eyes. Out of morbid curiosity, I searched online for anything referring to the fishing spot that Tom had found, the place where we'd encountered that thing. I wanted to know if there was anything that may have warned us about that monstrosity beforehand, any sort of subtle hint or indication that something wasn't right. As terrible as it sounds, I wanted there to be something that could have avoided this entire tragedy, something to shift the terrible weight of survivor's guilt that I was feeling. If not, then I needed to let people know what happened. I needed to warn anyone who might have thought it was a good idea to go there. Memories of Tom, Gavin, John, and Jenny flashed through my vision as I typed. What I found sent chills down my spine. After digging through link after link, I found myself presented with a series of news articles. There were several, each telling a similar story. Boat missing off the coast. Fishing trip lost at sea. Is this the new Bermuda Triangle? Reading through them, numbness began to crawl through me as I was forced to relive the events of that night. The articles each detailed boats that had been last seen going through an area that seemed to roughly match the coordinates that Tom had taken us to. They explained that even with the increased Coast Guard patrols, the frequency of these missing boats was only increasing. The only thing that they had ever managed to uncover from that site was debris. That is, until they found me. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.